Alright, now that we have our CryEngine set up, let's go ahead and open the editor. Navigate to the bin64 folder within your build directory and run the editor executable. If it's your first time running this build of CryEngine, it will ask you to log in to your CryDev account. Let's choose Open Level and find the forest level located under the Single Player folder. This is a really well done showcase level that is bundled with the CryEngine SDK, and we will use this to go over some of the basics. This editor is actually called Sandbox, and the game engine that runs it is CryEngine. Most game studios use similar map editors to this, so a lot of the workflow and tools we're about to go over are standard. First, let's talk about the camera controls. To look around, hold the right mouse button as you move the mouse to rotate the camera. To move the camera, use the WASD keys, similar to playing a first-person shooter. If you haven't played many games, then you can also use the arrow keys, although I'd recommend getting used to the WASD keys since they're pretty standard for most games. Practice flying around the path and check out the scenery to get your bearings. To change the camera speed, just click on these speed presets down here. Each speed also has a slightly faster mode if you hold shift while moving. I usually use 0.1 when I'm checking out an individual asset or prop, 1 when I'm working on a small contained area, and 10 when I need to fly across a whole map quickly. By default, we have a bunch of performance data showing here. We'll be using this later on to gauge how expensive our scene is, but for now let's hide this clutter by pressing this eye icon twice. Now let's fly the camera out to get an overview of this map. To do this, I simply change my speed to 10 and fly backward using the S key as I look toward the ground with the mouse. Okay, let's zoom back onto the path and fly down towards this cool little fishing village. Shift spacebar can also be used to toggle on and off icons and bounding boxes, so if you ever want to hide or show this info, just toggle it with Shift plus spacebar. As you can see, this scene is pretty complex, so let's go over to our Layers tab on the far right side of our roll-up bar. We want to create our own layer so that we can work independently without accidentally messing up the work that's already been done here. Go ahead and click this Create New Layer icon and name it something you'll remember. Now they'll be listed alphabetically, so locate your new layer and double-click the arrow here. Notice that all the other arrows disappear on all of the layers. This means that objects and entities on these layers are now frozen, which makes it easier for us to focus on our own little area without accidentally selecting things from the scene. I recommend always working on your own layer in a scene like this. Double-clicking the eyeball will also toggle between hiding and showing all layers, so give that a shot. Now that we know how to freeze and hide layers, let's unfreeze our layer so that we can start adding to this level. I'm going to fly over to this area and then select the second tab, which is our Terrain tab. I want to add a little island, so I'm going to select the Modify tool and choose this Flatten brush. Next, I'll zoom out so I can get a good view of the layout. I'm also going to increase the outside radius of the Flatten brush and then use its Height Sample feature by holding Control and clicking on a piece of surrounding terrain. Now when I press left click with the flatten brush, it will bring the terrain towards the height that I just sampled. If it's changing too slow, just crank up the hardness and/or the radius. Think of hardness as the brush's strength. If you'd like a more schematic view of your terrain, you can use these same tools in the Edit Terrain window, which can be found under the main Terrain tab here. This view can be helpful when you're just starting to block in a basic layout of your level, but I usually just edit the terrain directly in the viewport since the feedback is more direct. Now I'm going to use the Rise Lower brush, which allows me to raise the terrain up when I press the left mouse button and lower the terrain when I press Control plus the left mouse button. You can also hold Shift to switch to the Smooth brush, which helps soften some of these hard edges. Now that we have a nice little island here, let's take a look at the Layer Painter tool. This is the tool we use to paint the tiling terrain textures like grass, dirt, mud, rock, etc. onto the terrain. Currently, we'll use the materials that are already loaded in this level, but in our CryEngine terrain video, I'll go into detail on how to set up your own. I'm going to adjust my brush radius here, and then I'll just paint down some grass by holding down the left mouse button. Now with this tool, there really isn't erasing. Instead, you just paint over the terrain with another material to get rid of it. Usually, you'll want 4 to 5 terrain layers to work with so that you can blend between surfaces nicely. Let's spend a few minutes getting some cool blends going, and then we'll move on. Okay, now I think we should add some assets to the scene. Click on the Objects tab, which is the first one, and then select the Brush button. Most of the objects we create and export from our 3D modeling program can be found and placed using this brush tool. I don't know which insane programmer first decided to call these brushes, but let's pretend it makes sense. CryEngine's search filter works really well, so if you remember any word or letter combination from the asset you're looking for, just type it in here and it should filter it correctly. Let's start with placing one of the fishing houses that come bundled with this level. Just type in house within the filter, and then let's expand this fishing house directory. I'm going to select Fishing House C and drag it out onto my island. If your object doesn't stick to the ground automatically, make sure the Follow Terrain and Snap Objects button is pressed before dragging it out. Now that we have our house, let's talk about some of the basic tools that we can use to transform objects in our scene. The first is our Select tool here. This is useful when you just want to select something instead of accidentally moving it. Now, probably the most useful one is the Move tool, and you can select it here or press the 1 key as a shortcut. This behaves similar to the Move tool in most 3D programs. You can drag these gizmo handles to constrain to a particular axis, or you can select this little box that connects two axes together. This way you can move an object in both axes at once. For instance, if you have the yellow square, that links the X and Y together. Then I'm basically sliding this along an imaginary ground plane without changing its height or Z coordinate. By using these axis constraints, it allows us to work in a 3/4 view while still accurately changing position. Now, with the house selected, you can also hold Ctrl-Shift and click anywhere in your scene to transport your selected object to the new position. Now that we have our house positioned in our scene, let's use the Rotate tool here. You can press 2 to switch to rotate mode, and I recommend getting used to these shortcuts so you're not constantly going back to the toolbar. This tool works slightly different than other 3D rotate gizmos in that you select the axis handle that you want to spin it around. For instance, if you want to rotate this around the X and Y ground plane, I would click and drag the Z axis. I'll also turn off the angle snap option so that it can rotate freely. I like to imagine that these handles are wooden dowels that you need to spin with your hands. The best way to get used to this method is repetition, so just practice rotating your house with the different axes until you have a good grasp of it. I'm also going to turn off my Snap to Grid option so that I can smoothly fine-tune its position with the Move tool. I'll do a quick check to make sure the terrain's not poking through the floor inside. Okay, now that the house is placed, I'm going to jump back to our layer painter and tweak a little bit of the ground textures. Also, you'll notice the color swatch here. If your hardness is all the way to the right, or a value of 1, then this color is multiplied with your terrain material, allowing you to fine-tune your color palette. If you don't want your texture to receive any additional color, you can drag your hardness all the way to the left, which is a technique we'll be using later on for our portfolio scene. Now I'm going to select the house again and jump back over to the Objects tab. If I scroll down, it shows me which model file or CGF the placed object is referencing, and we can just click on other files to swap it out. This is a handy way to preview objects in a directory, rather than having to keep dragging new objects into the scene. Notice that some of these assets complement the house we already placed, so let's select Fishing House C again, and then with the Move tool selected, just hit Ctrl-C to copy the house. I'll move this copy off to the side slightly, and then drag our model directly down so that I can swap in a different piece. Placing things in this manner becomes much quicker since the new object already inherits the previous position and rotation. I'll start with this little roof add-on, and then I'll turn the angle snap back on here so I can quickly rotate it 180 degrees. Next, I'll switch to the Move tool again by hitting 1, and make sure it's intersecting with the house cleanly. Now I can hit Ctrl-C and swap out this piece with the Fishing House mod When. Here we can see that the Move gizmo seems crooked in relation to the window. That's because this object's reference coordinate system is set to View here. If we change it to Local, then the gizmo will stay relative to the object rather than the view. In other words, if you want your gizmo to update as you move and rotate the object, then you should use Local, otherwise View is a good default. By understanding how a scene is put together in a level editor, you'll hopefully start to author your assets in a way that encourages modularity and variation. With just a few additional pieces, this house can have many different variations within the level. Now let's go back to our Brush tab and filter Dock. I'll drag a piece out and then start cycling through variations that are included. Notice that these are all registered in the same location. That means when the artist created them in the 3D modeling program, they all shared the same origin point or location within the scene. I'll start with the stair version and move it over towards the shore. Now I'll select the Y-axis so that when I hit Ctrl-C, the copy slides along that direction. Next, I'll change the model to one of the flat dock pieces under the prefab list to swap it out. Here's a great example of a subtle variant where just a few boards are different. This wouldn't take much time to create, and it allows for much more variety in the scene. Also remember the Shift spacebar toggle from before, if you want to see your object's boundary box, which also helps with selecting. Now I'm going to go back and use the flatten brush in combination with Control to sample the height and bring the terrain almost flush with the dock. The terrain in CryEngine is primarily based on a height map, which is a square, grayscale topographical image where white is the highest point and black is the lowest. The main limitation to this system is that it prevents overhangs in terrain. A common workaround for this limitation is to place rocks or custom props that you can sink into the terrain. I'm going to filter rocks in my brush library, and I'll see what we have to work with. Again, I'm dragging one out into the scene and then changing the model that it references so that I can quickly cycle through them. I'm liking some of these forest rocks because of their clean lighting planes on the top. Some of the other ones I was looking at were a bit too noisy for this location. Now if you want to change the size of an asset that you've placed, press the 3 key to switch to scale mode. By default, all the handles will scale uniformly so that you don't squash or stretch out the model. Right now I'm trying to position these in a way that blends naturally with the flow of the terrain so that the transition is less obvious between terrain and prop. A lot of times I'll move the camera at a position that I feel best captures a certain scene, and then I'll start balancing the composition from this view. With an open, explorable area, there's no guarantee that a player will look at a scene from the same view, but I find that people naturally want to explore interesting areas, so you can kind of anticipate and direct movement through a series of key shots. And in this case, the small dock pathway will force them to approach the house at a certain angle, so it would make sense for us to cater towards this view. This is where I really start to appreciate CryEngine's real-time lighting. The fact that we'll be seeing the scene's lighting as it will be lets us make informed and immediate decisions. In other engines, you might position the rock near the house and then render the lighting for an hour or two, only to realize the shadow completely flattens the house details. Okay, I've placed a few more rock props around the island. Now I want to show a cool trick that helps with placing smaller set dressing pieces like furniture and decorative items. So let's go back to our brush tab and type in furniture in our filter. I'll expand the shelves directory and drag out the first CGF. Next I'll do a quick check to see what other variants we have. Alright, I'll use this one here. Now I've already showed that Control plus Shift and left click will transport a selected object to wherever you click. In addition, if you press Control Alt Shift and click a location, it also aligns a selected object to the surface angle that you click on. This can be very useful anytime you want to place an object perpendicular to a surface. So go ahead and spend a few minutes decorating this Unabomber style cabin using whatever assets you can find. While working on interiors, you'll probably want to freeze the house so that you don't keep selecting it by accident. To do this, just select the house and hit the F key. Now you won't be able to select the house until you press Control F, which unfreezes all. Okay, so now is probably a good time to save this level, so go to the File menu and select Save As. I'll create a new folder called Test Levels and name it Forest Island, so that I don't accidentally overwrite the original forest level. Now for the fun part. Let's fly over to the start of the dock and press Control G to drop into game mode, and now you have a gun. Looks like we accidentally dropped some rocks in the path of this NPC boater man. Sorry, bro. I find it extremely important to evaluate assets and scenes from a game view so that you can make informed decisions. Sometimes your texture or materials will look great from far away, but look terrible up close due to low resolution. It's up to you to make sure your assets actually look good in-game and in screenshots alike. Plus, it's just fun to run around an environment you put together, and if this kind of thing isn't actually fun for you, it honestly probably isn't the right career choice for you. Okay, this cabin looks pretty depressing, so great job, time to move on. Let's fly our camera back to the dock and get a good view of the vista here. Now, go to the Main Terrain tab and choose Time of Day. We'll be going over all these important lighting properties in our CryEngine lighting tutorial, but for right now, we can drag this purple slider across to see different time of day settings they've already set for this level. I'm going to start with this really dark blue lighting. Now, to add additional lights to our scene, let's go over to the Entity tab and expand Lights. Now, drag out the regular light here into our scene. You should already see a slight indication of the light, but we'll need to drag it up out of the ground. use Shift Spacebar to toggle on the info so that you can see the light's radius or area of effect. You can see how easy it is to use lights to help accent your scene and define focal points. In this case, I've also copied the key light and used it to help define the right side of the house as well. First, I'll select the house and press F to freeze it again, if it isn't already. Now let's fly into our creepy living room and add some interior lights. Now I'll select the ceiling fan and press Ctrl-C to copy it straight down. Now I want to swap the copied fan out for this ceiling lamp model, and I'll also scale it down a bit. Now this model has an emissive light material giving it a glow effect, but it doesn't actually emit any light into our room. So we want to create another light entity and place it near the lamp to give the illusion that it is. We can also use the Control plus Shift trick to quickly position the light near the lamp model. Now I'm going to lower the light radius to something like 4 so that it's not leaking out of the house too much. Now it's starting to look a little better, but also a bit strange because we don't have cast shadows on this light. We can change the light properties here to cast shadows on console medium spec or whichever spec you think they should be turned on at. This is a very expensive option, so I'd mostly enable this on a single light per building and maybe just see it on high config specs. Alright, last but not least, let's take a look at CryEngine's vegetation system. This will allow us to simply paint geometry onto the ground rather than hand placing it, and that's obviously very useful for things like grass, bushes, rocks, trees, etc. I spent a few minutes creating a little terrain patch to the left of my island, so we can use something like this to test on. Go ahead and choose the Vegetation tool found under the Terrain tab. Now click the Paint Objects button and increase your brush radius so that it covers a decent area. Now we can select one of the vegetation zones that they have created for the level. Let's start with rocks and just left click to paint the rocks onto the terrain. Hold Control while painting to remove or erase vegetation you've already painted. I like how these rocks are looking, so I'm going to add them to the house area. Now it might seem like a ridiculous amount of detail, but since they fade away relatively quickly, you can afford to have these pretty dense. Next, I'm going to jump back over to my test area and look at some of the other vegetation categories. If you ever feel like it's not responding or painting, double check that the category has the check mark next to its name. That toggles the category on or off, and you might accidentally turn it off, not realize it, just like I did with this giant forest. Good God! Now it's also important to note that you don't have to paint with every object within a category. For instance, I can just select this river tree D within the large category and paint only with it. These little Scraggle Bag trees look kind of cool, so I'm going to go over and paint some next to Stephen King's fantasy home. Take some time and really experiment with these categories and see what you can come up with. The more familiar you are with the assets, the easier it will be for you to plan and create your own level. In the CryEngine Vegetation tutorial, we'll discuss how to add our own models and tweak all the parameters, so be sure to reference that for a more detailed look at the system. Alright, now let's do one last tester and check out our creation. Okay, so that wraps up our Intro to CryEngine tutorial. Go through this a couple times, make sure you're comfortable with basic camera controls, terrain editing, using layers to lock and toggle visibility, placing objects using the brush tab, moving, rotating, scaling objects, swapping out different models once you've placed them, adjusting the time of day settings and placing additional point lights, using the vegetation system to paint models, and finally saving your scenes. Thanks for watching. Boom!